Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah.
Welcome to DEUTSCH University, and I'd like to welcome our esteemed guest speaker, Daniel Haqiqatjou. And Daniel was born in Houston, Texas. He attended Harvard University, where he studied physics and philosophy. He completed a master's degree in philosophy at Tufts University, and he writes and lectures on contemporary issues surrounding Muslims and modernity. He has spoken at universities and mosques around the U.S., and his work has been featured in outlets such as the Washington Post, The Atlantic, CNN, Al Jazeera, and Public Discourse, Mashable, and First Things. He teaches as an adjunct faculty member at Respect Graduate School, and you can write his writings at muslimskeptic.com. And as you may already, most of you know, Brother Daniel was invited to speak at Tufts University, and he, because of pressures from outside groups of Tufts, he was disinvited. And Alhamdulillah, as Allah says, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Perhaps you may hate something, but it's good for you. Brother Daniel is here at Tufts on the same day that he was supposed to speak at. And not only did he speak at Tufts, but he also spoke at MIT and Harvard University. And on topics that even he wasn't even planning to speak on. And Alhamdulillah, they were very well received by everyone. And we knew through this invitation that happened how much people are excited and interested in these topics and like discussing them. So we'd like to thank Brother Daniel, and he's an inspiration to a lot of us here. How in living in this society, how much we can be pressured by like outside ideologies that don't adhere with the Islamic values. So without further ado, we're gonna, before Brother Daniel starts speaking, we're gonna do a quick Quran recitation by Brother Faris, and then we'll start with Brother Daniel.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وقل الحق من ربكم فمن شاء فليؤمن ومن شاء فليكفر إنا أعتدنا للظالمين نارا أحاط بهم سرادقها وإن يستغيثوا يغاثوا بماء كالمهل يشوي الوجوه بئس الشراب وساءت مرتفقا إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات إنا لا نضيع أجر من أحسن عملا أولئك لهم جنات عدن تجري من تحتهم الأنهار يحلون فيها من أساور من ذهب ويلبسون ثيابا خضرا من سندس واستبرق متكئين فيها على الأرائك نعم الثواب وحسنت مرتفقا. I'll read the English translation right now. Allah says in Surah Al-Kahf, Surah the Cave, and say, the truth is from your Lord, so whoever wills, let him believe, and whoever wills, let him disbelieve. Indeed, we have prepared for the wrongdoers a fire whose walls will surround them, and if they call for relief, they will be relieved with water like murky oil, which scalds their faces. Wretched is the drink, and evil is the resting place. Indeed, those who have believed and done righteous deeds, indeed, we will not allow to be lost the reward of any who did well in deeds. Those will have gardens of perpetual residence, beneath them rivers will flow. They will be adorned therein with bracelets of gold, and will wear green garments of fine silk and brocade. reclining therein on adorned couches. Excellent is their reward, and good is the resting place. May Allah make us of them.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Thank you for inviting me here to Tufts. I graduated in 2010 my master's degree from the philosophy department here. And before that I was at Harvard and did a degree in physics and philosophy. So I'm very happy to be back on campus, have a lot of happy memories living near campus and eating at Carmichael, delicious cafeteria food. So I'm glad that I had the opportunity to come. There was this slight controversy of my invitation being rescinded at the last minute. And, you know, as the moderator mentioned, it only led to more opportunities. So I think that ultimately the truth will come out. You know, people who are willing to speak the truth and abide by the truth. It might seem like there's overwhelming public pressure and negativity, but we should always have that faith that Allah is going to make the deen victorious and the truth victorious, and we should look forward to that and have faith in that. So the topic of today's discussion is the dangers of liberalism. And before getting into the topic, let me just define what I mean by liberalism. We tend to use it in a political sense, meaning you have the liberal left wing and the conservative right wing. And that's not exactly the meaning that I want to focus on. Liberalism is a philosophical idea, and so I want to discuss liberalism as philosophy. And it is the idea that originated within the Enlightenment, within Britain and France and Europe generally. And there are certain figures, of Enlightenment figures, associated with developing liberal philosophy. And the basic idea of philosophical liberalism is that morality depends on maximizing freedom, liberty, equality. These three main points constitute the essence of liberalism. And anything that increases liberty, freedom, equality is good, advances progress, and so forth. Anything that opposes liberty, equality, and freedom is bad, evil, destructive, holds the human being down. So this is the philosophy of liberalism, and there are many sub-philosophies that fall under the overall liberal paradigm. So if you understand liberty in the philosophical sense, then the left wing, or the Democratic Party in America is, you know, no one will say we're opposed to maximizing liberty, whether they're Democrat or Republican. They just have different ways of approaching that. So, for example, does tighter gun control laws maximize, or does it increase liberty or decrease liberty? Well, depending on who you ask, whether on the political left or the right, they'll differ whether gun control increases liberty or not, but both sides agree that liberty is what is important here. Maximizing freedom and rights, that's what's important. They just have disagreements on exactly how to achieve that. And that's purely within the domain of American politics, but even you can look at other political systems like socialism, communism, even fascism. They're all concerned with this. They all come from the liberal tradition broadly, philosophical liberalism, and they're all concerned with this question of how do we free human beings, and how do we grant what kind of political and economic system will confer the most liberty, equality, and freedom to society and the individual. So this is just to give you some basic definitions so that you know what I'm really talking about. So now to switch gears slightly, let me ask a basic question. How many of you know Muslims who have left Islam? Within your family or classmates? Just raise your hand if you know any Muslims who have left Islam. Okay, how many of you know young Muslims who are seriously questioning their faith and are approaching leaving Islam? Okay, pretty much everyone raised their hand. I think that there's different ways to understand this. We can understand it as just chance, random occurrence. People come into the faith, they leave the faith. There's not really a rhyme or reason to it. That's just the way the world is. Another way to approach it is that there are specific trends and specific ideas and ideologies that are in no subtle way affecting the minds of Muslims that are encouraging them and getting them to see Islam as backwards, retrograde, and outmoded, and something that should be discarded in favor of some other goal, such as freedom, equality, liberty. And if we look at the history of liberalism and how liberalism developed and how it was deployed throughout the world, this was the deliberate goal. Liberalism was a tool that was used against the Muslim world in colonial times, in the 19th century, 20th century, and the 21st century up until today. And so we have to recognize this, and we have to be aware of these dangers, and we have to be aware of how this is happening. Because if we don't understand how it's happening, we can't address it in an adequate way. And I just wanted to, the whole point of my talk today, and I'll try to keep it to about 45 minutes, is to explain exactly how this has happened and the kind of reflections that we as a community need to have within our current context. And one of the things I emphasize to the places, in the different places that I talk, usually it's mosques, masjid communities, and I try to emphasize that as a community within the American context, we need to have a 100-year vision of our future, and not just a short-term 5-year vision, okay? Because if you're blinded by your current circumstances, then you're going to make decisions that will threaten or endanger your 100-year future. And I feel that the Muslim community has gone into this habit of being too reactionary to current circumstances and forgetting the 100-year game plan, okay? And I'll give you a specific example. Ever since, I would say about 2000, the year 2000, 2001, the Muslim community has been shifting more to the left politically, and this has been from political convenience. Republicans, since the Bush era, have instituted all kinds of negative policies and measures that have affected Muslims overseas as well as domestically, and we'll talk more a little bit about that. Obama, to a large extent, extended those policies, but the Muslim community seemed to be blind to the anti-Muslim policies that Barack Obama implemented. And I often get in trouble for saying that because so many Muslims love Barack Obama and see him as the savior of the Muslim community, when the reality is that you can read the report from the ACLU, for example, that says, and they're liberal-oriented, that no significant policy that George Bush and the Republicans had implemented in their term in office, 2 terms in office, was discontinued by Obama as far as Muslim rights are concerned, domestically and in terms of foreign policy. There were superficial changes, but by and large, things remained the same or even were expanded. And this is what the ACLU is saying. That was their assessment of Barack Obama. And they'd point things to like surveillance, right? The surveillance state only expanded. Spying on Muslims only expanded in the Obama era. So things like that, the Muslim community needs to be more aware of. But then Donald Trump won the election last year and was inaugurated this year. And that has shifted the Muslim community even more to the left. And there are reasons for this. Donald Trump is very openly anti-Muslim in how he speaks and the policies that he advocates for. But there's a cost, and I don't feel like the Muslim community in America has really evaluated objectively the cost of allying with the left. Okay? And this is an example of a short-term calculation that, okay, Donald Trump is in office, we need to make political alliances with the left. And that might make sense from a communal policy perspective, but what is the tangible cost of that? One of the main costs is that you, as a community, have to sacrifice some of your teaching and positions on the issue of sexual morality. So the issue of LGBT, right? Which is something that is not controversial as far as Islamic ethics are concerned, that same-sex behavior is prohibited, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but there is very clear ethics that as Muslims we all must abide by. And the cost of allying with the left wing, which is very aggressively, almost militantly pro-LGBT and advancing certain kinds of rights claims regarding same-sex marriage and so forth. The questioning of gender, transgenderism is now increasingly popular and politicized issue. What is the cost of the Muslim community adopting these kinds of views tacitly or explicitly? Now you're seeing increasingly Muslim American leaders saying that the Muslim community needs to embrace LGBT, the Muslim community needs to stand for all of these specific policy points, otherwise we're hypocrites. How can we criticize the Islamophobes but then be homophobic ourselves? These are the way that these issues are framed, and it's a very problematic frame, but it's seemingly compelling to the average Muslim and definitely amongst the younger generation. But if you as a young person in college or in high school are adopting these kinds of views and perspectives, then how are you going to understand the Quran, when Allah is speaking about Qawm Lut? Or how are you going to understand Islamic sexual ethics when you read certain hadith or you read certain opinions from ulama and scholars of the past? What is going to be your internal state? You're going to feel a lot of tension, to say the least. You might feel despair. You might feel confusion. And then this is going to cause a problem for you in your faith and may even lead you to leave the faith. So if that's the kind of struggle and confusion that a large percentage of our youth are going through as a direct result of our community's political stance, then fine, you might win political points in the 5-year short term, or 8 years, if Donald Trump wins another term in office, but you've lost an entire generation of Muslims. You've lost an entire generation of Muslims, and that will have a big effect, okay? Because that's one generation, and that compounds with the next generation and the next generation, such that in 3 years, will there even be Muslims in America? And if there won't be, it's not going to be because, in my humble opinion, it's not going to be because Donald Trump, throws us all in concentration camps. That's not going to be the reason. The reason is that we just have self-attrited. The Muslims have just left, and there's statistics about this that I'll tell you in a moment. So my point is, as a community, we need to have a broader vision and a broader calculus that has a 100-year perspective. And this is the example of the prophets as well, and I can give you many examples of the depth and the distance of their vision and how they were thinking about their community and the tangible decisions that they were making in the here and now. And that's not to say that the immediate circumstances aren't important and that we shouldn't be strategic and wise as a community in how we navigate the waters, only when when that comes at the expense of our future is that problematic. And so we should not have this hyper focus on Islamophobia that totalizes our entire concern, such that we forget the danger of the left and the danger of liberalism as a philosophy primarily on our future, our collective future in this country. And so I think that what is most productive for us to do in order to inculcate that 100-year vision is to think about how we develop our youth and what kinds of trends and ideologies our children and young people are subscribing to. And what's disturbing is this, what we can call a de-Muslimization of Muslim youth. De-Muslimization of Muslim youth. And I'm using de-Muslimization for a specific reason. I'll tell you the significance of that in just a moment. But what we're seeing is a trend of cultural Islam. Islam as culture and Islam as political identity. To be a Muslim means to subscribe to very particular modes of dress. You know, if you're female, you wear the hijab. If you're male, maybe you have some facial hair. You dress a certain way, you talk a certain way. But it's just superficial. When it comes to actual beliefs, then it's a free-for-all. Okay, so long as you claim to be Muslim, that's all it takes to be a Muslim. That's what being a political identity means. It's just on your own claim, and there's no necessary beliefs that you have to subscribe to or practices. The way that I summarize this is Muslim by body, Muslim in terms of your body, but not in terms of heart and mind. And again, you'll find Muslim young people today who will subscribe to all kinds of un-Islamic, anti-Islamic perspectives, and proudly so, but they still consider themselves unapologetically Muslim, right? And this is their rallying cry. We're unapologetically Muslim. And they go to marches and rallies and shout this, but what does that actually mean? Is there any content to your Islam? Or is it just a culture? Or is it just a political identity and a political movement? And again, I can give you examples in terms of sexual ethics, the lack of commitment to Islamic law in general, and we can define that further in Q&A if you're interested. Or this idea of universalism, that as long as you're a good person, it doesn't really matter if you're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or atheist, agnostic, and so forth. As long as you're a good person, those differences are just superficial, right? And that's, a very destructive kind of view, and you can see how it's conducive to apostasy. You can see how if you think that, well, I'm a good person, well, why do I need to believe in God at all? Why do I need to believe in things like heaven and hell and the afterlife? Why do I need to struggle with myself to oppose my desires and to act in Islamically correct ways? It's such a burden. Why should I do that as long as I'm a good person? So this is something that you'll hear over and over again from young people, and I get messaged all the time online about this kind of question, like, why do we need to accept Islam? As long as you're a good person, they just don't feel any motivation internally or reason that would motivate them intellectually or spiritually to abide by or subscribe to Islam. And what I'm arguing is that this is a direct result of a cultural Islam as political identity. And so I'm making a lot of claims here about the state of the American Muslim community, but let me back that up with a few statistics. So these are all Pew surveys. 52% of U.S. Muslims believe that traditional Islam must be reinterpreted. 52% believe that traditional Islam must be reinterpreted. Over half of Muslims say that, US Muslims, that society needs to accept homosexuality and accept same-sex marriage. Half of Muslims in America believe this. What's significant about this statistic is that over the past 10 years, there's a 20 percentage point increase in Muslims who say that society needs to accept homosexuality. Whereas for Christian groups, it's only been a 10% increase. So we're more than double outpacing Christians in our acceptance of this specific kind of sexual ethic. Another very startling statistic is with attrition rates, meaning what percentage of people who are raised as Muslims continue to identify as Muslims in adulthood. What percentage would you estimate? So it's just about a little over 70%. That means about 30% of people who are raised as Muslims, when they reach adulthood, they no longer identify, either because they've converted to another religion, or they've left religion entirely, they're atheists, or they're just non-affiliated. And that's really the fastest growing religion. There's this kind of cliche that, oh, Islam is the fastest growing religion. The numbers don't back that up. The fastest growing religion is a new category that has been identified by the sociologists studying this, of the non-affiliated, meaning people who generally have a sense that God exists, may or may not exist, but religion in an organized way doesn't really have much relevance to life. So why should I bother subscribing to Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any other organized religion? I'm just non-affiliated. That's the fastest growing religion in the world, or the fastest growing category in the world, and definitely in the US. So those are the kinds of things that we're seeing today. Let's look at how liberalism has affected Muslim history and Muslim civilization. And so I'm of a Persian background. Both of my parents are from Iran. And for the most part, my extended family is secular. Okay. Many of them don't even believe in God. Most of them don't have any connection to Islam in terms of their practice or their beliefs. I would characterize them as being more secular and liberal, even the ones who are still in Iran. So maybe about more than half are in Iran, and then the rest are in the US or Canada. And religion is not something that is on their radar. And I think that's something to reflect on. You have a culture and a region that has been Muslim, deeply Muslim, for over 1,000 years. Okay? How is it that within 1 or 2 or 3 generations, that civilization has crumbled in such a dramatic way in the past 100, 150 years, 200 years? Again, is it something that just naturally happens? This is the atheist's contention, that as education improves and increases, people naturally become less superstitious and leave religion and become secular and atheistic. This is their anthropology of civilization. But there's a simpler explanation, and a more compelling one that I referred to earlier, is that there is a deliberate process to condition the Muslim mind and to control and manipulate the Muslim mind into rejecting his own religion. And we can look at the process of colonization in the Muslim world and imperialism from Europe and how liberalism played into that as a tool to catalyze, as a catalyst for bringing secularization and the rejection of Islam and leaving of Islam in the Muslim world. And so I'm coming from Persian background. If you're coming from a Turkish or South Asian or North African background, then you have probably noticed the same things with your own families. And I think this is something that we can reflect on and trace exactly what the causes of this were. So when we look at the history of colonization, the target number one of the colonizers were the religious institutions, the madrasa, the madaris, the tariqa, right? The institutions of Islamic learning and development of Islamic, the development of the believer. That was target number one. And there were different ways that they attacked these institutions. One was to defund the awqaf, the public funding for those institutions. Dismantling those institutions by discrediting the scholars, the ulama, and portraying scholars as these kinds of retrograde people who are committed to just blindly following the past and are not interested in progress. They're not interested in joining the civilized world. If you want to be part of the civilized world, you need to throw off, this old-fashioned concern with, the Islamic sciences, how to maintain purity, tahara, how to pray, how to pay zakat, all of the details of being a Muslim and being a true believer. That's fine. We're not saying that that's bad, but okay, it's not a priority right now. We want to join civilization, so we need to emphasize the sciences. We need to emphasize these particular European disciplines and European modes of thought. And our institutions need to be structured in order to teach that and to get Muslims to jump onto that program of Europeanization. And so this is how they discredited and dismantled traditional Islamic institutions. And that happened just, within the past 200 years. And it leads to a domino effect. And we're seeing the fruits of that. We have been seeing the fruits of that for the past few generations. Because as soon as you cut off the source of knowledge, ilm, okay, so we're Muslims, so knowledge comes from Allah through the Prophet, peace be upon him, and through the teaching of the Sahaba and the Salaf and the generations of scholars. And that's the wellspring. That's the wellspring of life, okay? How to flourish and how to live in the best way in this life in preparation for the next life. So if you cut off that stream, if you cut off the live stream, okay, then you're going to see, okay, you won't see the impact that same generation, but within 2 or 3 generations, then slowly people are starting to leave. People are starting to leave little by little until, before you know it, everyone is gone. And you have entire families, such as my family, where, for the most part, as I characterized it, they are secular. So, again, am I just speaking speculatively? Is there any data? Is there any history? Are there any texts to back up what I'm telling you? There are. You can read the work of the colonizers because they're very explicit about their project. They're very explicit on how to control and manipulate the Muslim world. And why would they do this, right? Are they just, evil people that had it out for Muslims and had it out for Islam? Well, no, they were motivated by the desire to control Muslim populations, to take advantage of Muslim populations, to get Muslims to support their European colonizers with open arms and open hearts. That was their intention, and it's very profitable. There's a clear economic motive for that. and also a nationalistic motive. If you have a civilizing mission, you want to civilize people to bring them to the light of your tradition, which is liberalism, the Enlightenment, then you're motivated to go to wherever that you're militarily conquering, occupying, imperializing, and get the local population to see you not as an enemy, but as a savior. Okay, so there is a motivation for them to manipulate Muslims and to get Muslims to abandon their own tradition and abandon Islamic law and the Sharia to accept European law. Okay? And that was the first step in making the Muslim world, reshaping it in the image of Enlightenment Europe within the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And so I mentioned Lord Cromer, and Lord Cromer is very explicit about this. He says that we can't just go to Muslims and say, abandon the Sharia. We can't go to Muslims and say, abandon Islam. Because if we're that direct, the Muslims will fight us. Like literally, they'll fight us off if we go and say that. What we should say instead is, hey, Muslims, it's fine, you have Islam, but you need to reform Islam. You need to reform Islam and bring it into the light of modernity. Because look, times change, and if you stick to these outmoded ways of thinking, then you're going to fall further and further behind, materially, economically, and politically. So just simply reform your religion, and if that's the message that we go to the Muslim world with, then they will embrace us. And what we need to do specifically is to take those reform-minded Muslims. We need to make sure to take them to Europe, to acculturate them to European values, to educate them in European institutions. And these are the de-Muslimized Muslims. The de-Muslimized Muslims. And that's the term that I used before. It's coming from Lord Cromer. And so what he said explicitly is that the de-Muslimized Muslim is not really a Muslim. Reformed Islam is not really Islam. That's how you destroy Islam, by reforming it. Because all it does is destroy Islamic law, Islamic ethics, and that's how we can manipulate and control the Muslim population and therefore the Muslim world. So what should be our reaction to this as Muslims today? Think about what has been lost. Think about what civilization has been lost. Islamic civilization, with its rich history, is in tatters. It has been ripped apart and systematically destroyed. I don't know about you, but that makes me very sad. That makes me very sad, and you feel that sense of loss. And every day I feel that. Every day I feel that sense of loss. Because my family, right? These are the people that I love. But, they're on a certain path, and you do your best, but every day, okay, you're confronted with that. So it's very personal, and sometimes people criticize me for being too emotional and being too aggressive in the kinds of critiques that I make. But if you feel what I feel every day, it's torture. It's really torture when you realize exactly how things have unfolded and how so many people, our brothers and sisters around the world and ourselves, have been duped. We've been tricked. We've been manipulated. How does that make you feel? So we really should feel that, and we should viscerally feel it. And the way to respond is to identify the source of the problem and to think about it clearly, rationally, and understand how do we prevent this from continuing. Because the process is ongoing, right? what I asked you at the beginning was how many of your friends and family you know who are considering leaving Islam or who have left Islam. And it's the same issues, it's the same process that is doing this, right? It's the internalization and the acceptance of liberalism that encourages Muslims to view their faith, to view Islam, to view Islamic law as retrograde, backwards, and contrary to progress and advancement. This is the same message that was given to our ancestors 200 years ago, 250 years ago in the colonial period. And it's the same message that's being given in the United States and Europe and the West in general to our youth today. And so let me give you an example of how this works. I'll give you two examples that will make it a little bit more real for you. Think about hijab, okay? And hijab, when it's discussed today, it's always framed in terms of choice and empowerment, okay? And so Muslim women insist that I wear hijab, but it's my choice. No one has forced me. No one has oppressed me. I'm empowered by my, wearing the hijab. On and on and on. All of this language that's used by Muslim women, this is all liberal language, okay? The importance of choice, okay? Because the lack of choice means the lack of liberty. The lack of oppression. I haven't been forced to do this. I'm liberated. Hijab actually liberates me. This language is very explicit. And I'm not going to give you a deeper critique of freedom, liberty, and equality today. There's much that can be said about that. But what I want you to reflect on is the language that's being used. Because if you internalize a certain form of language, then you internalize the ideas and the concepts that underlie that language, and that can have many unintended detrimental effects on your faith. But continuing on the topic of hijab, what the colonizers did was said that look at European women and how they dress. Look at European women and how they behave and how they act with the opposite gender and how they hold themselves. And so you condition Muslims to look at that image of a European woman as the ideal to be strived for and to view that as the natural way to dress and behave. And the way that Muslim women dress as unnatural and contrary to that natural state and that default. And so if you internalize a certain vision of what it means to be appropriately dressed, then anything that diverges from that is suddenly a burden, is suddenly a cultural accretion, is suddenly something that you can dispense with, right? And our sisters are going through this every day. Right? And you, just by the way they talk about the hijab, that it's a burden, so I either will, okay, it's a burden, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm not going to wear hijab. Or it's a burden, but I'm going to maintain the hijab because of love of Allah, love of my religion. But both sides agree that it's a burden, that it's something that extra that you have to do in order to abide by Islamic law. So the problem is the underlying mentality. And it happens through conditioning and the implantation. Maybe you're familiar with the movie Inception. Okay, what's the idea behind this? It's a popular movie, science fiction, directed by Christopher Nolan, British filmmaker. The idea is that if you plant an idea in the human mind and make it seem like that person has thought of the idea himself, then you can easily manipulate the person. Okay? So this is what inception is. And that's what liberalism does, is it implants certain ideas and makes Muslims think that it is of their own volition and their own mindset that they are reforming their religion and they are trying to modify their religion to come into conformity with the modern world, or to make their religion more tolerant or accepting or whatever else it is. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with tolerance. Don't get me wrong. It's an extended discussion, but we have to look at what is tolerance in the Islamic tradition and what is meant by that according to Islamic ethics, as opposed to alternative worldviews. So this is the example of hijab. How about the example of sex and sexual behavior? If you tell people that to be a healthy person, whatever desires you have, you need to act on them. And if you hold yourself back and you restrict yourself, that's unhealthy, and that's going to cause psychological harm, it's going to cause trauma, it's going to cause cognitive dissonance and all kinds of dysfunction. If you tell people that enough and you condition them to think like that, then they'll view Islam and its sexual ethics as something very backwards and harmful, literally harmful. I don't want to be psychologically dysfunctional. So we need to change the religion. We need to, clearly what God has said for this 7th century Arabia doesn't apply today, or they'll find different ways to justify reforming Islamic sexual ethics. And you can look at what's taught in the psychology textbooks, or what the APA recommends, and what they believe to be natural and conducive to mental health, psychological health. And they say explicitly, like, if a person has desires and for a certain kind of sexual practice, then they need to pursue that. And to hold yourself back from that is oppressive and psychologically maladaptive. And that's the recommendation that they give. If you go to therapy, that's the problem with Muslims going to certain psychologists who don't understand the Islamic perspective. That's what they'll recommend. Say that, okay, you need to go out and have a more active party life or social life. You need to, get on Tinder. You need to start finding, why are you holding yourself back? Why are you restricting yourself? Oh, okay, it's because of your religion. Okay, well, that's strange, but you realize that your religion is going to cause you mental problems, right? And this is like, Muslims have this experience. So what is the cause of that what is the impact of you viewing your religion as literally destroying you mentally? But do we take our understanding of what is natural and what is, in the case of hijab, who decides what is appropriate to cover or not cover, right? Who gets to decide that? Is it just a cultural thing? Or who decides what kind of behavior is conducive to your health, mentally or otherwise, to your flourishing in this life? Who gets to set those terms? How about our Creator, right? Doesn't that make more sense than just whatever is culturally convenient? And that's the other problem, is that so much of Western culture is unmoored and unanchored from anything. And that's why you see these cultural revolutions every few decades. Prior to the year 2000, maybe, look at the statistics on the acceptance of certain same-sex sexual behavior. They're very different than they are today. So what changed? Is it just that people came to their senses? This is not even within 10 years or 20 years. That's not even one whole generation. It's the same people, who had one view, and now it's a completely different view. Was there just, people are now more moral? Are we continuously discovering moral truths? How is that possible? What is the theory there? And it seems implausible. It just seems no, it's just cultural changes. Culture changes, and people, if you don't have an anchor to anything, then you're going to go with the flow, and you're not even going to notice that you're moving, right? That's the whole point of being unanchored, is that you're swaying with the water, but you can't even perceive the motion. For Muslims, though, it's different, because we are anchored. We do have a normative tradition that we look to, and that's our bedrock. And so even if we don't maintain that anchor, we can still recognize that there are these big changes that are happening culturally. So these are things that we need to be aware of. And what's happening today also, just as a final point before concluding, the process of colonization and imperialism has not subsided. The same forces that have been used for the past 200 years are still in effect, domestically and in terms of foreign policy. Domestically, you can see it's certain Muslims, certain political organizations, Muslim political organizations, that get the government funding. And you have to have a certain ideology to get that funding. You have to be okay with certain kinds of programs and certain political positions in order to get that funding. And that's a big problem because some of those positions in no subtle terms contradict Islam and are contrary to Islam. Look at NGOs. Okay, these are the organizations that are going to the Muslim world and spreading certain values, right? Certain Western enlightened values. Millions of dollars, billions of dollars, under the guise of aid, foreign aid, is being funneled into these NGOs. They're going to places like Egypt, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and spreading certain kinds of values. Okay, and the goal, the way that they describe it, is this is development. We're trying to develop the third world, or we're trying to improve we're trying to empower Muslim women, we're trying to empower families. That's the facade. The reality is that there is a very clear social program, socialization program, that you are spreading in order to advance your Western political goals and economic goals. Domestically, I mentioned funding. Who's invited to the White House, right? Who's invited to White House iftars, especially during Obama's time, right? There's a very clear profile of the kinds of Muslims who are put in these positions. And I'm not saying that everyone who's invited to the White House or accepts that invitation is, a secret agent or anything like that. But we have to be a little bit less naive about who's being promoted. And then look at media portrayal. What kind of Muslims are featured in mainstream media, whether it's on the news or through TV shows or movies? Typically, there's just two categories. You have the extremist, fundamentalist, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, scary, evil, bad Muslim, okay? And then you have the enlightened, liberal, progressive, Reza Aslan Muslim, Linda Sarsour. I'll go ahead and say it. Those are the types of Muslims that are featured in mainstream media. What about Muslims that are committed to their faith? They're reasonable. They're speaking in the language that people know in this country and in the West generally, are from this country, have been born and raised here, are devout, practicing, take their faith seriously, take Islamic law seriously, are able to articulate themselves. You're not going to see them on CNN. You're not going to see them on Fox News, or you're not going to see a TV show dedicated to that. You're going to see people like Aziz Ansari. You're going to see people like Reza Aslan, people who will openly admit that Islam needs to be reformed. Islam needs to be reinterpreted. They have different ways of saying the same thing, but that's the underlying message. And so that's not a coincidence. That's not by chance. It's very deliberate. It's very deliberate who gets to be on what platform. and again, this is perfectly in line with what has been done by colonialization, which Muslims got the positions at the top universities, Al-Azhar and so forth, which Muslims were put in front of, were put in governmental office, which Muslims were put in front of the TV cameras, were put in the newspapers. You had to have a specific ideology of reform if you're going to be promoted by the powers that be, the colonial powers. And the same exact thing is happening today throughout the Muslim world. Recently, in Saudi, this has been a big problem, if you've paid attention. So we need to be aware of this. And what is the ideology that is a basis of all of this? It's liberalism. It's liberalism. That's my message, the takeaway. If you don't remember anything of all of this bloviating that I'm doing, it's that liberalism is, in no uncertain terms, an enemy and agent for destroying Islam. And again, don't take my word for it. Even non-Muslim academics have attested to this. There's decolonial studies. Read Joseph Massad, Islam and Liberalism, respected tenured professor, I believe at Columbia University. Read his book, Islam and Liberalism, and his entire thesis is that liberalism was designed by European thinkers in contradistinction to and as a reaction to Islam. This is his thesis, and he justifies it very compellingly. It's a fantastic book. You should definitely read it, Islam and Liberalism by Joseph Massad, and verify to yourself that this is actually the case, if you don't want to take my word for it. So what are the takeaways here? And you know, the majority of what I've said has been pretty negative, but what positive, practical takeaways are there? The one takeaway that I would say is important, we need to have the 100-year vision as a community. We need to think about the implications of our choices for the next generation, the second to the next generation, and so forth. That kind of thinking is absolutely necessary on the individual level and the institutional level. At the individual level, you have to think about it because you have children, right? And your children will have children and so forth. At the institutional level, another big takeaway is that we have to think seriously about what it means to be mainstream. I'm not saying that being mainstream is something that is negative in and of itself, because it's not. I would love it if people like you and me were mainstream in American culture. But does being mainstream come at the cost of sacrificing our deepest religious commitments? If so, then maybe mainstreaming ourselves is not the best option. Maybe mainstreaming ourselves is going to come at too high of a cost that will sacrifice our viability as a community in 50 years, maybe even in 10 years. So, and this is something that you often hear from Muslims, I would say more so immigrant Muslims than black Muslims and other subcategories of the American Muslim population, is that, oh, we need to follow the path of Jewish Americans. Look at the success that Jewish Americans have in mainstreaming their community in American society over the past 50 years. And this is not very smart for many different reasons. You know, I could cite you the hadith about from the Prophet ﷺ about following them even onto the lizard hole, for example. You know the hadith. But just look at what has happened to the Jewish American community. And again, don't take my word for it. There was a great article, I forgot exactly where it was published, but it was written by a Jewish American who said, liberalism has destroyed the Jewish community. Liberalism has destroyed the Jewish community. And what he says in that article is that 50% of Jewish Americans don't really believe in God. Either they are outright atheists, or they have serious doubts that God even exists. 50%. And only 16% of Jewish Americans think that being Jewish has anything to do with Talmudic law, Jewish traditional law. So is that the kind of end state that we want for ourselves as a Muslim community? Do we want in 50 years only 50% of American Muslims to believe in Allah or to have any kind of conviction in Allah? Do we want only 16% of American Muslims to think that Islamic law, the Sharia, what Allah has commanded and what Allah has given to us of behavior and ethics internally and externally, we only want 16% of Muslims to think that that's important? Like, is that really something that we want for ourselves? If not, then maybe we should rethink following in the footsteps of other communities who have been decimated by liberalism and by this desire to be mainstream at any cost. Again, being mainstream, no problem with it in and of itself, but what is the cost of that? And is it a cost that we can pay? And finally, some more practical advice. There is a very important hadith where the Prophet ﷺ has said that a group of my ummah will continue victoriously adhering to the truth until the last hour. A group of my ummah will continue victoriously adhering to the truth until the last hour. So we need to very practically think of ourselves and aspire to be in that group. Okay? This is our life raft in the storm. Okay? We need to be laser focused on making sure that we're part of this group. And how do you do that? Well, the first step is, do we really know the basics of Islam? Do we know what is individually obligatory, fard ayn, upon us? Have we studied and learned the requirements of tahara, of salah, of prayer, of zakat, of hajj, of the beliefs, the pillars of belief? Do we know who Allah is? Do we know about malaika, the angels, the books, the messengers, the last day, qadr, all of the required pillars of belief? Have we studied them? Okay, these are individual requirements as Muslims that we have to know, because God will question us on the last day when we're standing before Allah. These are the things that we're accountable for. Have we really studied these on an individual level? Are our masajid and organizations emphasizing this and making sure that there's a minimum level of knowledge that our youth are attaining? These are very practical questions, and it's not for lack of resources. You don't need to go to Mauritania. You don't need to travel to Azhar or Medina to learn how to make wudu properly, how to make ghusl. You don't need to travel across the world to do that. There are plenty of imams, mashallah, all of the masajid across the United States who are teaching this and can teach this on a regular basis. Right? So it's not for lack of resources that we cannot attain this knowledge. So that's one practical step, is to make sure that you're covered yourself, that you've attained that knowledge. The second point is that get married. If you can, if that's what you want. Not everyone has to get married, and there's a fiqh discussion about who is required to get married and who doesn't have to, and so on and so forth. But if you can and you have that desire, then get married and try to have as many children as possible to your capabilities and to what you can manage. But strive to have a bigger family. Strive to have more children if you can. And the impact of this and the benefit of this is that within one generation of doing this, within 2 generations, 3 generations, there's this demographic force, right? There's a demographic force of Muslims who, you can't build institutions without numbers. That's the basics of it. And we should have children to the extent of our capabilities with the assumption that we're going to teach them the basics and necessary knowledge for being good Muslims and being good human beings, right? If you're just going to have kids and they're going to end up being thugs and, criminals or whatever, ingrates, no, that's not what I'm saying. You want to make sure to be able to teach them and bring them up with tarbiyah so that they're strong believers and strong members of the Muslim community. And if we do that very deliberately, we're not talking about change in 100 years. We'll see the impact of that within a generation, 2 generations. And this is happening in Europe. Islamophobes and anti-Muslims in Europe are in crisis mode right now because the birth rates between Muslims and non-Muslims is so divergent, is so disparate. Muslims are having too many children, is the way they describe it. And so churches are closing down, synagogues are closing down, but mosques are being built and churches are becoming mosques. And so this is very alarming to anti-Muslims. So that will just indicates to you the impact, the demographic impact with having children. And this will also counteract the attrition that I mentioned earlier, that 30% of Muslims, or 30% of people who are raised Muslims, leave Islam. We can counteract that through knowledge and through this kind of demographic program, which is kind of a weird way to say it, but just have kids, that's all I'm saying. Just have kids, inshallah. So I'll leave it at that. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.